prior selves. My name is Ridwan.
And my name is Nura.
You'll hear from us to explain what this session is as we dive into it. And then afterwards, after that session concludes, we'll have a live Q&A with another member of our board, Rizal, who hosted last time's webinar. And yeah, we'll go ahead with it there to answer any questions after this. So without further ado, we'll go ahead and get started. Hello, everyone. Welcome to ADEP's second Qatra session, What's Race Got to Do with It? My name is Ridwan. I'm a recent graduate from The Ohio State University with my bachelor's in political science. And with me today I have...
Nura. Hi, everyone. I'm glad to be with everyone today. My name is Nura. I am a postdoctoral fellow and lecturer at Princeton's Woodrow Wilson School of, what is it called? Public Policy and International Affairs. I just started the job like a few weeks ago, so I'm getting used to the title.
Absolutely. Yeah, we're so excited to be here with everyone tonight. And now before we begin, of course, so I know we have a couple first-timers, some people that might be unfamiliar with our webinar series, so a brief introduction to this. These Qatra Sessions are a new webinar series that we started this summer in order to cover relevant social justice issues and theory and to really talk about their relevance to our communities and raise awareness of the work that our community, our Afghan-American community, can do to address these issues. This, of course, was inspired by that cliche phrase in Farsi, "Qatra qatra darya misha." In other words, drop by drop, a river is formed.
Yeah, and I think that though it may be a cliche phrase, it's very powerful because little by little we can build a movement. And we hope that these sessions can be engaging in a way for you to hear about issues our community may not discuss often, but that really do affect our lives, our livelihood, in ways that we can move forward together. So our goal is for this to be the first step towards engaging many African Americans with these topics. And we plan to have these sessions culminate in a leadership initiative in the winter to discuss strategies for mobilizing our community and prepare us for the coming elections, particularly the 2020 presidential election.
Oftentimes, the very political conversations that we have elicit a wide range of reactions and responses from within our community. But most especially, it's when someone brings up that something is racist that we get this exact question and response. And so the purpose of this webinar is going to be about unpacking that, to offer a brief understanding of what race and racism are, why those ideas are so fundamentally intertwined with our most pressing concerns in politics today, from the issues that we have with our president to the crisis on our border and the general growing divide that we're seeing in our country today.
Yeah, and so we hope that this is not like some comprehensive everything you need to know, but we hope this offers a brief guide, like a Cliff Notes version of what the topic is for individuals to move on from, and hopefully we hope it encourages you to pursue your own research of the topic. We'll post links and suggestions to books and articles and to complement the series, and we hope that this is a useful endeavor for us. So this leads me to my question, Ridwan. What is race? Is race biological? Are like black men born better ballers in basketball than white guys? Like what is race?
That's a great question, Nuro, and I think that's exactly where we need to start with this. The simplest answer is that race is not biological. It's a social construct. And now what does a social construct mean? A social construct is basically making something up in order to have meaning.
I built this school where mutants could learn to focus their powers in a positive way, and also learn that mankind was not evil.
A great example of this, I'm a big comic book fan, is the X-Men. The X-Men are mythical heroes created by Stan Lee and Jack Kirby in the 1960s. And this is a fictional group of people that were created in a fictional world where people could be born with a random gene that gave them superpowers. But those superpowers presented a nuance that these writers are so famous for investigating. One of those nuances being that oftentimes the public perceived these people as a threat because of the powers that they had, and these people were often otherized. And that's exactly how race functions.
Yeah, it certainly otherizes, and there's a deep history And it's not just a black-white issue, and I think that's one of the key things we want to review today, is that it's cross communities, and as we review it, you'll see sort of the patterns that exist. So for me, having studied this, it's hard for me to sort of like be like, who's the best person to read from? But I really do think of this book by an anthropologist named Audrey Smedley. And race, she writes, she quotes, represents attitudes and beliefs about human differences that began to evolve in the late 17th century in North America and the Caribbean Isles, so like the Caribbean, end quote. So I wanted to start like briefly by discussing the Wild Irish and sharing like a couple comics that bring to life the origins of race before we get into like what we know as like typically when you think about race and racism, we think of Black Americans, but this stuff started before them, really, with the Irish. And like it's funny for some because when you think of white folks today, you definitely think of Irish, but there was a time period when Irish weren't white, and so it's really important to sort of think about that because that's the root of a lot of this ideology. Historically, so we know that Ireland is next to England. The English invaded Ireland in the 12th century. They wanted to extend their control into Irish territory, and for the next 500 years, there were on and off tensions with the Irish as English tried to control their areas. And this tension continued on into the 16th century. And there was like this partial failure to gain control. So a lot of it's about power, and power dynamics really came to life. So during the reign of Elizabeth I, not to be confused with the current queen, it is like 1559 to 1603, Irish were called the Wild Irish. And so I'm going to read two quotes. This is how they were described. Rude, beastly, ignorant, cruel, and unruly infidels. Cannibals, heathens, superstitious, idolatrous, unclean and loathsome, wicked, barbarous, and uncivil. And like the ironic thing is, when we say infidel, they were Christian. They were Catholic. So how can they be infidels if they were God-believing like these Protestant English? But these were these words that they were using, and the interesting thing is not only were these words of uncivil and unclean, like think about these words in news streams today. Like Ridwan, when you hear those words, like makes you think of how some Muslims are described in the news today, right? Or like how like any stereotype about like brown folks, they still say like ignorant, beastly, rude. Like these are things that we're using up until present day. And so it's interesting to see the origins. And what we're going to show on the images now are a couple cartoons. So the first one is Contrasted Faces. On the left is Florence Nightingale. On the right is Bridget McBruiser. And what is the difference? Bridget looks like an ape. The nose, the eyes, she's not seen as civil in this photo. And then you move on to this photo, the British lion and the Irish monkey. And you see this British lion looking down, and then there's an Irish person depicted. And they are depicted as a monkey. So when we discuss monkey as this racist thing, every group that has been racialized in the United States particularly, they're always described as ape-like. But that ape-like sort of comparison began with the Irish. And then the last one is from Harper's Weekly, and what you see is on the right this word white, and that represents the Irish. It's one ape. And then on the left is a Black American, and he also is presented looking ape-like. And they both pretty much look similar, except like the Black American has like a bit of a darker hue. They're both wearing hats. The Black American doesn't have shoes. But it's interesting again to see that before Black Americans were even brought in the picture, these kinds of stereotypes already existed, right? And particularly the word uncivil. Like, we will get back to that word. The word uncivil is definitely one of the most pernicious words because that's a word that is used now on Muslims, on Afghans. We're not civilized. So what does that mean? You're not civilized, so someone has to civilize you. Hi, colonial power. Hi, people. That's their justification to sort of subjugate individuals and take control of them. So fast forward to The United States, so England, Ireland, that tension happens. At the same time, the English are coming into the New World and invading lands that are now the present-day United States, the Caribbean, Central America, South America. And the transatlantic slave trade occurs. And with the transatlantic slave trade, you have millions of individuals from different tribes, regions across the African continent that are put on ships and brought over. And if our historian on deck, Ali Ulumi, has any clarifications, we will post it, because I'm not a historian, but I think the history context really matters for us to understand why race is a social construct, and to know the fact that race emerged as a concept even before United States as a country was a nation-state identity. So this concept is older than the country of the United States, which is wild, right? We have the transatlantic slave trade that emerges, and what labor is used by elite whites is they need labor for farming, agriculture, so they utilize these Irish poor whites, Native Americans, Africans for labor. And what happens is we have a turning point. And in 1676, Bacon's Rebellion occurs. And what's powerful about Bacon's Rebellion is that it is a coalition of all these three groups: poor whites, blacks, and Native Americans. And at that point, they're not even black, Africans, right? Coming together to overthrow then Governor Berkeley and chasing him out of town from Jamestown, Virginia. And this is a really important turning point, because at that point, anthropologists argue that rich whites were disturbed by the powerful rich white men, and so a series of decisions were made by this elite in power. And between 1690 and 1725, between that 30-year period, a series of discriminatory laws are put into place that classify people. And so that classification is sort of what we know today. So yes, slaves went into Brazil and the Caribbean, and they had their own laws and history, and there's similarities. But the United States started this like one-drop rule. So one drop of black blood makes you black, it dehumanizes you. So suddenly there are biological distinctions that occur. And African Americans are dehumanized, and the system begins to be set into place. And so you'll see from these images then that slavery then really comes into fruition, right? People are, these justifications are made, they're uncivil, but they're strong, they're brutish, we're going to use them for labor, and they are no longer seen as human, and they're used and treated as property, and treated like property, treated less than what they would probably treat animals on a farm like they were not treated like humans by any means, right? So slavery really plays a critical role in cementing the conceptualization of blackness in America. And it's interesting because, side note, a lot of Afghans, not all, but a lot of Afghans are Muslim. And so Afghans in America who are interested in the origins of Islam in America, the origins of Islam in America are also from the transatlantic slave trade. And there's a lot of great history on Omar ibn Said and how he was the first person to write a book in Arabic in the United States. So all of that aside, we all know the history of Abraham Lincoln. He emancipates slaves, and suddenly we have freedom, right? All the problems go away, right? Obama is president. Racism is over. JK. So Jim Crow comes into fruition. And that is the piece of history that I wish, like, I've talked to my parents about. I know Ridwan and I, we're siblings. We've talked to our mom and dad a lot about Jim Crow and what Jim Crow has done. They are emancipated. So at this point, theoretically, people are allowed to leave. Things are supposed to change. But what Jim Crow does is Jim Crow is basically a set of laws, state and local laws, that brought about racial segregation in the South. And you have people like James Burgess, who's a political scientist, founder of my discipline, who are making these calculations that Black folks are not smart enough to rule for themselves, so we're going to put laws into place to help them rule or take their rule away because they don't get it. Literally using biological rationales that are wrong to reinforce this system, right? So slavery ends technically, but Jim Crow in a lot of ways really is just another manifestation of slavery by another name. And so these laws are enacted in the late 19th or early 20th century by a Democratic-dominated state legislator, and they were enforced until 1965 in the Civil Rights Act. And there are so many manifestations of Jim Crow. You can't live in the same areas. So you see these residential segregation maps we'll talk about later. If you look at someone the wrong way, you will be killed. So I wanted to take a moment to pause to talk about lynchings. So the map that I'm showing you now shows areas in the South where there were the most lynchings that occurred. So Phillips County, Arkansas had 243 people lynched. Cato Parish, Louisiana, 54 people. Lafourche Parish, Louisiana, 50 people. Tananis Parish, Louisiana, 40 people. There's a really cool link we're going to put at the end that Google did with a nonprofit organization that shows a visual and illustration of lynchings through history. And essentially what lynchings were was they would hang someone for a crime as ridiculous as that black dude looked at this white woman side-eyed. And so they are hung by a tree, they're lynched, they're burned, and white families come and witness it for entertainment. So this kind of dehumanization continues on well into 1965. Lynchings are still something that can occur in present day. And it's this violent history that we really need to be aware of, because that sort of scaffolds the baseline of what the country, American political development, comes in tandem with racism. So I want to share this quote by Toni Morrison, who is a really acclaimed Black female author who passed away just last week. And she says this: "There is no such thing as race, none. There is just a human race, scientifically. But anthropologically, racism is a construct, a social construct, and it has benefits. Money can be made off of it. People who don't like themselves can feel better because of it. It can describe certain kinds of behavior that are wrong or misleading. So it has a social function, racism." And I think it's powerful coming from Toni Morrison. But what I want to kick this off to, back to Ridwan, is how do we conceptualize race beyond the experience of Black Americans? Like, how does is race something that just affects African Americans or individuals who identify as Black, or does this exist for other non-white groups too, and how?
Absolutely, Nora. Thank you so much for giving us that background, because I think it's really important to highlight that this conversation and these issues about race and racism really begin first and foremost with the dehumanization of African Americans and the way that our legacies of race and racism often disproportionately target Black communities first and foremost. So it's important to consider how this extends to other communities as well, and to understand, where do Afghans and Afghan Americans fit into this conversation as well, and how especially do immigrants fit into this conversation as well? How have these communities been racialized? And a lot of that comes with the history that Asian Americans have here in the United States. Asian Americans have a long history that is tied to the issues of race and racism that we have in the United States. When work on the Transcontinental Railroad began in the mid-19th century, a lot of elite white people decided that they wanted to try to bring in cheap labor, and they found a lot of that in China, and so they started importing and bringing in a lot of Chinese workers to come immigrate to the United States and start working on the railroad. And as time passed, these laborers started to establish themselves here in the United States. Their families started to grow. They got involved in the gold rush in California and started to, amass wealth and become, a more relevant part of the United States. But, as they started to really establish their roots here, the question of citizenship was a lingering issue that the government didn't address. And especially as the gold rush continued, and gold and silver and a lot of those valuable metals became more scarce. A lot of white people began projecting a lot of their frustration with the scarcity of this mineral upon the presence of Chinese communities, and started blaming them for the inability of them to be able to, continue to amass that same kind of wealth and prosperity. And ultimately, the government decided to address this in 1882 with the passing of the Chinese Exclusion Act, which prohibited all immigration of people of Chinese origin. And so this caught a lot of Chinese people off guard in the United States. They were caught at a crossroads. They had to decide, were they going to stay and continue the work that they were so invested in here in the United States, or were they going to abandon that and go back and reunite with their families and relatives in China, with the prospect of never being able to continue everything that they had worked so hard for here in the United States. And so in 1898, there was a landmark Supreme Court case that supported this a little bit, United States versus Wong Kim Ark, and that provided a path to citizenship for Chinese people that were born in the United States. But the Chinese Exclusion Act itself was not repealed until 1943. And that, essentially, that long period of time from 1882 to 1943, set a precedent of Chinese people and other people of Asian origin that often looked very similar, and white people, didn't necessarily distinguish between them. It set a precedent here in the United States that these people were perpetual foreigners, that they did not belong here in the United States. When you have a policy like that here in place for so long, it establishes that kind of a notion that spreads socially across the country. And as you all know, this isn't necessarily the worst of our country's legacy of grappling with race as it relates to Asian Americans, because that legacy has continued. After the attack on Pearl Harbor in 1941, the United States immediately declared that all people of Japanese origin in the United States be arrested and kept in isolated camps across the country, under the fear that many of these people were supposedly spies and foreign agents. And until 1945, these Japanese Americans were stuck in these camps, and this policy is maintained until after the conclusion of World War II. And it's important to recognize, when we think about this policy and we think about how this affects us, that this fundamentally dehumanized and othered people of Asian origins. It gave our government, by implementing this kind of policy, gave white people in the United States the precedent to perceive these people from Asian nations as threats that didn't have a place in their community. Now, eventually, with a lot of activism and work that was done, reparations were given to survivors of internment that were still living in the United States in the 1980s. But it's alarming how that process ultimately came about. And I think that's really important to highlight. After the conclusion of internment and the repeal of the Chinese Exclusion Act, a lot of universities in the United States began encouraging scholars and students from parts of East Asia and South Asia to come and study here in the United States. I know some Afghan-Americans were able to benefit from that as well. And it was through a lot of these members of these communities proving their value as an academic asset and resource that the government found that reparations for Japanese internment to be a palatable issue that they could accept and they could work on. But that is not okay. That kind of policy coming in because someone is providing an asset establishes a precedent that these communities are only deemed to be useful because they are providing an explicit resource and service to our country. No person or group of people should have to work to have their humanity validated and have someone, especially a government, apologize to them for treating them as less than human. But unfortunately, that's exactly what's happening today. Our country still refuses to properly acknowledge and address its legacy of racism with African Americans and slavery. So when we mention these examples, especially as it relates to Asian Americans, it's because, and also with the legacy of racism towards Black communities in the United States that Nidal mentioned, we mention these examples because things like the Civil Rights Act and this demand for diversity and inclusion that we have nowadays are a pursuit of bringing an era of peace and equality here in the US. But that pursuit often neglects addressing the cracks in between that happen when we're trying to pursue that. And those cracks in between are the history that hasn't been acknowledged and atoned for through reparations or similar actions to acknowledge that our country has grown to embrace these issues themselves. And that's an essential point to touch on. Because when you leave those kinds of cracks in between how you tackle and address race and the 400-year legacy of racism that exists in our nation's federal policy, you have issues come out of those cracks. And what's one of those many issues and the repercussions of that? White supremacy and gun violence that we're seeing here today.
Yes, so Ridwan, what you were saying about the cracks is so fundamental because our base has never been solidified. So these ideas of equity and equality that are in the Declaration of Independence have always been ideals and dreams, but there has never been a moment in history, like in the United States, that we've actually like completely lived up to those ideals. And a lot of the history that you just highlighted is erased and made invisible. So we think about like the contemporary experience of Asian Americans. That experience has existed for them, like you were saying, for generations, like generations on generations. This is not new. Foreigner is not a new concept. And so for organizers now, as we try to build tools to organize communities and mobilize, we really need to know that the stereotypes that are used on us are old. They're old, they have history. This is nothing new. And we need to know the shape and mechanism, what we're dealing with, if we want to actually engage in it in a way to actually build something healthy and meaningful, right? And so knowing that history is so fundamental. I actually get cranky sometimes because I love data, that I have to spend so much time thinking about the history before I can like analyze my data. But the data we analyze has a story behind it, and we need to know the context. So what you're saying about the cracks is so fundamental to that. And there's more, right, Ridwan? Like, it's not just Asian Americans. I want to reference, like, if you want to know the history of Arab Americans, very similar. Khalid Beydoun writes about this a lot. He's a critical race theorist and law scholar. We'll put up some links to some law review articles that he's written. He's Kimberly Crenshaw's student who's a critical race theorist. And so a lot of this really relates to that. But I want to kick it off back to you, Ridwan, because you made this connection between gun violence and white supremacy. And I think that right now, given what just happened most recently in this onslaught of gun violence that is occurring, it is an interesting moment to really reflect on how that connects to this piece of the story.
Absolutely, and I appreciate that you're bringing that up. I just want to backtrack real quickly. The reason why we bring up these Japanese internment camps and this legacy of Asian Americans in the United States, you mentioned the history of Arab Americans. A lot of that history and the history that Afghan Americans have here in the United States as well is intrinsically linked to those specific issues that I brought up with the Chinese Exclusion Act and these internment camps. And so not only when we're talking about gun violence and white supremacy that I'll get to in just a second, but also when we're thinking about the border crisis that we have and the way that migrants are being dehumanized today, that's something that the government has done in the past that we need to pay attention to as well. But to address what you mentioned about gun violence and white supremacy, when we're thinking about the cracks that are left in between our nation's sloppy solutions to the issue of race in our country, it's produced a number of issues within that. And chief among them, as you can see today, especially in the last couple of weeks, is the issue of white supremacy and gun violence. For as long as our country has existed, so too has existed a colonial attitude that's stuck with our white communities. It's a sense of entitlement that this nation is rightfully theirs, that this nation and country belongs to white people, and anything other than that, and anything that comes in difference to the way of life of white people and their sense of being should be deemed fundamentally wrong and unjust. You see that with, especially with our president and how he reacts to the demands of people of color and the way in which they challenge, a lot of the unjust policy that he presents. And this is what empowered slave owners. This attitude is what empowered slave owners to treat African slaves as less than human. A lot of our conversations around race, concerns the language that we use. So when people mention the N word, for example, and say that non-Black people have no place to use it, that you can't use it, it's wrong. It's because that word was used in the time of slavery by slave owners to explicitly refer to the worth and status of Black people in the United States as being a laboring commodity that wasn't entitled to the basic respect that a human being ought to be treated with. It literally dehumanized them. So when we say not to use that kind of language, it's because of that kind of a history that it has. Even after the abolishment of slavery, you mentioned yourself the legacy of Jim Crow and the impact that it had on Black communities in the United States. That the rise of Jim Crow came at the same time as the rise of the KKK. And these were policies, these were groups that were being formed to specifically not only deny Black citizens the rights that they had, but also, be a fear tactic to ensure that they weren't a relevant part of our populace, a relevant part of the political discourse here in our country. That's part of the reason why it took so long for us to get a Black president.
Yes, we can. Yes, we did. Yes, we can.
But, in addition to these policies, like forcing individuals to pay a tax in order to vote, to the segregation of schools and entire communities, this brought us to the passage of the Civil Rights Act. And, even when that Civil Rights Act was passed, a lot of the states in the South still refused to integrate their communities and refused to address the issues of segregation that were happening in there. But the issue that happened, and something that we really need to highlight there, and why it relates to gun violence and white supremacy, is that racism didn't just die after the Civil Rights Act and after Southern states finally relented and accepted integration. Racism continued to evolve, and it evolved into the war on drugs. There are many recordings and aids out there, if you just Google it right now, that show the explicit conversations that former President Richard Nixon mentioned that the war on drugs was specifically a way to target Black communities in the United States.
America's public enemy number one in the United States is drug abuse.
The war on drugs was an intentional strategy used by our government to suppress these communities by pitting the criminal justice system against them. The FBI famously introduced weed and crack cocaine into these communities, and as it spread and law enforcement subsequently targeted its distribution, the corresponding sentencing that happened for people that were caught with these substances ensured a twisted result. It ensured that a lot of these people were charged with sentences that were almost twice the length of being caught with a more dangerous or more potent drug. And so ultimately, as that was happening, we also saw that there was the use of private prisons coming about in the United States as well. And by our government allowing, our criminal justice system to be outsourced to private industries, that allowed for those prisons to operate almost autonomously and to facilitate the use of these people, the vast majority of which were Black, to use these imprisoned people as cheap labor to manufacture goods, namely clothing for big companies. And this constant evolution of tactics, the way that this really progressed, reveals an explicit agenda that existed in our government after the passage of the Civil Rights Act to maintain and protect whiteness as the face and identity of America and what it means to be American. It specifically wanted to target Black communities in order to weed them out of our streets and to keep them away from the image of what people saw when they came to the United States and understood what was or wasn't American. And when we come to gun violence and the issues that we're seeing, especially in the last 10 years, the conversation, has now come to the national stage again. Whether it's Sandy Hook or Parkland, Florida, or even the 2 weeks ago in El Paso and Dayton, these attacks not only reveal a troubling issue in our nation's inability to prevent this repeated violence, but it also indicates that we haven't truly dealt with the underlying issue behind these shootings themselves. The shootings from this past weekend and many others, including the Charleston church shooting, were all racially motivated incidents fueled by a desire to address supposed threats to white people and prevent foreign invasions, as is quoted by many of these shooters themselves.
And
White.
right, but I know you want to talk about white supremacy, but to make this real, how old were you when our mosque was bombed?
I was just 10 years old.
You were 10 years old. And this is the Islamic Center of Greater Toledo. It's a huge mosque. You're seeing the photo now, on the highway. And what happened is that Fox News was talking about Muslims a lot, and this vet was really upset, this white male, about what's going on with Muslims. So he looked up the closest mosque to him that was big. And on Sunday, we have Sunday school. And at that time, Ridwan, our aunt, was running the Sunday school. And she remembers, like, this white dude came in, and we always have guests come over. And so I want to make this real before you go into white supremacy, about how much this affects. And I bet a lot of you, and please feel free to share in the comments about stories in your community, how real this is, right? He came in and set up these homemade bombs in our mosque. And he detonated the bombs 2 hours after everyone left. And so my aunt left, and the bombs detonated an hour later. And the thing with our mosque is it has a tricked out water system. Like, the water filters are amazing. So the bombs go off. Had they gone off in the way they're supposed to, the entire interstate would have been in shambles, right? And that interstate connects people east to west, north to south. It's a really big international interstate, right? That's all we're known for, is people are known to drive by Toledo, Ohio. That mosque was damaged for over 2 to 3 years.
Yeah.
Like that. I did not walk into that mosque until it was fixed. I was traumatized. And this has happened to religious sacred spaces of Sikh people, of Jewish people, of Black Christians, of Muslims. It is occurring across communities of people that are of religious communities that are not white. It's another manifestation of white supremacy. And I was in Ohio, and I remember being terrified because you were 10, our youngest brother was 7 or 8, and we always spent Sundays there, and it happened on a Sunday. So I share that as an anecdote, but to say that this stuff is real, it's alive, and about a lot of people that are watching this have similar stories of things happening that have happened in their neighboring regions that are just as harrowing and deeply personal, right? So I don't want to get too personal, but I feel like we should just like kind of contextualize. This is not just like history and stuff in the news. Like, this stuff actually affects what's going on to us in real life. We're literally survivors of these systemic forms of racism and targeted violence that affect our community.
And thank you, Nura, for bringing that up, because I think one of the most unfortunate, products of, a lot of these shootings happening and becoming so common in the United States is that we forget that these issues often happen in our own communities. I always forget that happened when I was so young here in our own community here in Toledo, Ohio. And I think it's important to recognize that, these shootings and this gun violence is unfortunately becoming normalized here in the United States, and that's not okay. I think I saw a graphic that there were something like almost 250 shootings in the last year in the United States alone. Yeah. So I think when we talk about these issues, it's become so prevalent and so common that we forget about instances like the one that you mentioned here in our community. But to go back to, continuing into, what fuels and what inspires this gun violence, one of the biggest issues that we really need to address as we talk about race and racism is white supremacy itself. White supremacy is a severe issue that sprouts as a response to our nation's inability to fully acknowledge and reckon with its history with racism. Our inability to swiftly target domestic terrorism from white nationalist groups is a startling concern that will only continue if our country doesn't properly address its history in implementing policy that disproportionately has demonized and harassed people of color. So when we ask, what's race got to do with gun violence? Well, it's precisely the fuel and motivation behind gun violence and the reason why we haven't been able to properly prevent these shootings from continuing to occur. Now, you may be asking, why haven't we been able to take these guns off the streets? And the simple answer to that, and I'm sure you've heard this answer in the news as well, is that the money and organizations that are backing the politicians that have supported policy, including the war on drugs and our relaxed policy on guns, is still sponsoring those same people and keeping them fixed in their positions on, keeping gun policy and the way that guns are legislated the exact same way so that we can't take guns off the streets. And more importantly, white supremacist violence itself is a direct response to our nation's growth, an attempt to become more intersectional and acknowledge the troubling history that issues of race and racism have when we consider the issues of gender and immigration that we're also struggling with today. To reject the role that identity and race has in this specific conversation is just a denial of the stark reality that we're facing right now. And it's a refusal to acknowledge that this is about more than just someone holding a grudge, but it's about entire groups of people in our country not being able to come to terms with what our country's history actually looks like and the many tragedies and injustices that have been perpetuated by our government itself. And that's precisely why we need to have this conversation on race and racism in order to understand just how closely linked our issues with race are to these imminent concerns that we're struggling to grapple with and address here in the United States today.
It made me think, and I have to bring in another Toni Morrison quote, the last one. It's from a 2016 New Yorker piece she wrote called Mourning for Whiteness. And again, she says, personal debasement, quote, personal debasement is not easy for white people, especially for white men, but to retain the conviction of their superiority to others, especially to black people. They are willing to risk contempt and to be reviled by the mature, the sophisticated, and the strong. And if it weren't so ignorant and pitiful, one could mourn this collapse of dignity in service to an evil cause. The comfort of being naturally better than, of not having to struggle or demand civil treatment, is hard to give up. The confidence that you will not be watched in a department store, that you are the preferred customer in high-end restaurants. These social inflections belonging to whiteness are greedily relished. So scary are the consequences of a collapse of white privilege that many Americans have flocked to a political platform that supports and translates violence against the defenseless as strength. These people are not so much angry as terrified with the kind of terror that makes knees tremble. And so I think her quote really brings together what you're talking about, that it's so bad that they're willing to give up their dignity and vote for someone like President Trump, that they're willing to engage in violence, and that as people of color, we need to mobilize. And a lot of this is knowing this is important because this is a really critical moment for us to mobilize, to protect ourselves, unfortunately, for just basic survival, right? It has come down to basic survival. So, anything you want to add to that, Ridwan?
No, absolutely. I think you really hit the nail on the head that, this conversation that we're having, we shouldn't be having this conversation in 2019. But the reason why we're having it is because, unfortunately, it has come to our survival. It's life or death for the vast majority of people of color. And so in order to be able to be, properly aware and ultimately to just be safe, in the United States today, we have to be able to understand where a lot of these issues come from in order to understand just how we're going to be prepared to address them.
Right. And this takes us to the last portion of our webinar before we wrap up. Academics have been using these big words for a long time. We don't have time to go through all the terms, but I wanted to discuss critical race theory. It's a sexy word. I love it. But really what it is it describes a framework for legal and institutional processes. It gives language and academic verification for all of the things Ridwan was just talking about and we were talking about in terms of the internment camp, the railroads, and legal cases. And we're going to put links to authors such as Derek Bell, Kimberly Crenshaw, Charles Mills, Eduardo Bonilla Silva, Khalid Beydoun. These are just like a scaffolding piece of scholars that have brought articulation and language to how it works. So what critical race theory says is that race is institutionalized, race is part of the legal framework of America, and what I wanted to go through is just like a piece on like how we live with racism as institutionalized, but just showing you maps of where people live. And that's really what we're going to kind of end on. But we're going to discuss that and then how to move the conversation forward. But if you see from map 1, if there's any New Yorkers, give shout outs. The first map is a map of New York City, and particularly Manhattan. And you just see a lot of beautiful colors that don't blend in well. And you're going to see like that skinny island of Manhattan, and all the blue in that photo are where whites reside. All the green in that photo are where African-Americans reside. All the red in the photo is where Asians reside, and the orange is where Latinx communities reside. And people who are Afghan or other groups, they kind of like, this geographer didn't put them in the map, but they're also blended in. And what you notice is that people are living in segregated spaces, and that is not a coincidence. It's not just like, yo, he speaks Spanish, I speak Spanish, I'm going to live in this neighborhood. There's a concept such as redlining, where people are literally pushed into neighborhoods by real estate agents. There's discriminatory housing policies that push people out. Loans initially were given to certain people, aka whites, and not to others. The kinds of loans given to people look different based on the racial group that you are a part of. All of those, and so like one of the most conservative books, like conservative in that it's like a purely empirical sociological analysis, is by Massey and Denton, and they discuss the history of like residential segregation in America. The second map brings in shout out Ohio, Michigan, and sort of like the Eastern Coast snowboard, and you see like a big field of blue, so much blue. So there's a lot of whiteness, and what you notice is that the smatterings of color are on the coast. So Chicago, Detroit, and then if you look down on the coast, New York, Philly, Virginia is where folks live. And so there is history as to like why people live where they do, and even refugee resettlement now are pushed into certain areas. And so this I bring up because this shows how race is structural. There are structural elements, there's government policy, agencies, loan practices, discriminatory laws that have put into place a system that your outcomes of where you live are mapped, are influenced by that. So, in as much as race is a social construction, the outcomes are very real and tangible. So it's not like even where you live is influenced by your background in a lot of ways. We'll put up a lot more links to stuff that can kind of give you more information on that. And the current Trump administration has really loosened restrictions and made it worse for people in terms of like living comfortably. And race and class go together. So this intersectionality that is really important to take into consideration, because you see a parallel of like the racial hierarchy and class kind of like falling together in very interesting ways as well. Ridwan, was that too academic, or does that make sense?
No, absolutely. I think it totally links back to everything that we've talked about before. When we were talking about, the Chinese Exclusion Act and internment and even Jim Crow and the war on drugs, all of those are government policies that instituted ways in which communities of color have historically been discriminated against. And, everything that you've mentioned talks about how that extends even further than that. How simple local policy also, perpetuates a lot of the racism and discrimination that people of color are struggling to grapple with today. I think as we move this conversation forward, and we think about a lot of what we talked about concerning race today. We think about what you mentioned all the way back to the 1600s, and also think about a lot of the contemporary cases that have otherized other communities of color as well. I think it's important to think about how does all of this that we've talked about apply to the most pressing issues that we're seeing today, and how it otherizes, communities of color. How does it affect Afghans and Latinx communities and immigrant communities in general? And I want to begin with, one of the most unsettling crises that we're struggling with today, and that's our crisis on the border and how that crisis has come about. It goes without saying that our president right now is one of the most unabashedly racist individuals we've seen in public office in recent memory. From the moment his campaign began, the rhetoric he's used has been vulgar, it's been hateful, it's been demeaning, and it's been extremely dangerous in reinforcing an idea that, you're allowed to say such things in public and have that be accepted. And among the many outrageous claims that he's made over the last few years, his attacks on immigrant communities are especially salient for us, especially, as Afghan-Americans that, are so connected to the immigrant experience.
They're bringing drugs, they're bringing crime, they're rapists, and some, I assume, are good people.
I'm sure many of you may remember a lot of the bold claims that he's made, declaring that, during his campaign, he declared this, that we need to build a wall because there is a crisis on our border. He's made claims about our nation being invaded, false claims that among these groups of immigrants that are fleeing desperate circumstances, that among them are dangerous individuals who would somehow seek to harm our country. That fear is what brought about a ban on immigration from 7 Muslim majority countries. And that fear is what has empowered government agencies, namely the Department of Homeland Security and ICE, the Immigrations and Customs Enforcement Department, to be so bold in hunting, arresting, and harassing immigrants here in our country today. A lot of these immigrants are undocumented immigrants, and a large majority of them are predominantly Latinx. It's people that are coming from countries in Central and South America, fleeing desperate circumstances, fleeing unstable nations where violence and gang wars have overcome their communities, and their only solution to keep their families safe and their children safe is to leave that. And so, what ICE is doing, and I'm sure you've heard of this most recently, but they are locking up and rounding up all of these people that are trying to cross the border, that are already in the United States. They are locking them up and treating them as worse than we would treat animals. They're putting them in horrific conditions in camps that are filthy, that are overcrowded, and lack proper sanitary and food. Sanitary resources and food for people to be able to access. And, it's so startling that this has happened because, it's all too similar and all too reminiscent of the cowardice that our nation demonstrated when allowing the internment of Japanese Americans to happen. That was just, 70, 80 years ago. How is it that in less than a century, we're having this same issue happen again? And it's important to ask, what's race got to do with this? And I think you have to think about the outrage to the issue itself. There are still so many people in government and among the public that are defending this issue as an issue of security, or simply claiming that these people are, in violation of the law. But seeking asylum is not illegal. That is a right that people have. And our nation has historically welcomed refugees and allowed them to come in and find a path to citizenship and declare permanent residency here. So what's different about this today? Well, the fact that these people that are being rounded up by ICE, that are being harassed by our government on the border, are not white. That's the difference. Trump himself admitted most recently that he'd prefer to have immigrants from Europe come to the United States and seek residency here. And that's basically implying that he just prefer that we have more white people rather than have people of color from Central and South America come in and be a part of our country. And that's not okay. There is explicit racial bias that allows for the horrific conditions and targeting of these individuals in desperate circumstances to happen on our border. So when we say that there's a crisis on the border, it's not just because of this. It's because after so many years of supposed progress and how our nation has been able to supposedly acknowledge the humanity and place that people of color have, that despite all of that progress, despite having a black president, our government still allows itself to dehumanize and harass people of color. In this case, immigrant communities and Latinx communities, for simply wanting to discover freedom in a new home here in the United States that is safer than the circumstances that they have in their native country. So before we conclude, I want to take this a little closer to home and talk about what race has to do specifically with being Afghan. As Afghan-Americans, we often get really frustrated thinking about the circumstances of our ancestral homeland and the many issues that plague Afghanistan today. For as long as I can remember, ever since I was born, I can remember our diaspora always expressing outrage at mentions of violence and intervention that happened in Afghanistan and Afghan politics. And the United States, most recently, if you've seen in the news, is now finalizing a tragic and concerning agreement with the Taliban, allowing itself to basically cave into the demands of a terrorist organization that's responsible for so much of the violence and torment that's happening in Afghanistan today. And race fundamentally factors into this issue because these negotiations that are happening with the Taliban show the value that Afghan people have in the face of the United States. Afghans and Afghanistan are not a people or nation that the United States deems to be worth the patience and time to find a bolder solution and a path to peace that may take more time and sure may be more troublesome, but ultimately doesn't include the Taliban and empowers marginalized groups in Afghanistan instead to be part of shaping a better future for that nation. Our country's inability here, the United States' ability to dismiss that possibility, comes from the value that they place on Afghanistan as a nation of non-white others that don't deserve that kind of investment in a lasting and peaceful solution. I mean, think back to what we just discussed about the border crisis and the history of marginalization that I mentioned earlier in this webinar amongst Asian Americans. Afghans will always be marginalized and seen as a threatening other in this country and across the world because of our legacy as a recent immigrant community. And the history our country has with immigration and the precedent that's been set for what kind of value and worth immigrants have is important because that directly affects us as an immigrant community. And that implies that immigrants in many cases are less than human and don't necessarily deserve the same empathy and respect that white Americans have. So when we think about Afghanistan, you have to realize that, Afghans are being treated and seen in the same way that a lot of these other immigrant communities that are being targeted by our government right now are being perceived.
We would love your comments on that because I think that's exactly where we want the conversation to go. And as we conclude this webinar, this is the kind of conversation we want to take into our Winter Leadership Institute. So to conclude this webinar, I think that's a powerful place to end. And to know race and the history of race and racism and race theory is to know ourselves, how we are understood in the U.S., how our communities are understood, and the history is entrenched and is important for us to keep in consideration. So a lot of food for thought to think about moving forward.
Definitely. I think it's essential to not only think about, what these issues mean and how they influence our circumstances, but think about, how does all of this affect you? What can we do in response to all of this? I know you mentioned our leadership initiative previously, but if you could elaborate on, just the kind of work that we're trying to work towards as ADAP.
Yeah, I think it's important to consider the tools to respond to these issues, even if they feel foreign or out of reach right here in the U.S. We have a huge presidential race that our community needs to be paying attention to in order to see what kind of vision and policy we want to define our nation's future. the margin of victory in these battleground states are ones where we can really play a decisive role in making a determination of whether a state goes blue or stays red. So we really can be that deciding factor. I have some new data coming out that I'll share in the coming weeks that are really chilling and alarming in terms of showing the level of under registration of people that are naturalized voters. So basically, like our parents, or even myself. I'm an immigrant. I was naturalized, became a citizen when I was like 21, 22. And registering to vote is critical. Like, it really is like a matter of life and death for a lot of people and communities. I think that we owe it to our communities that if you have the capability to register to vote, you have to do it. We have a census that our community needs to participate in. There are congressional races, there are state legislative races. We need more people in office that look like us, that advocate for us to dismantle the white supremacist state that exists.
Absolutely. And as we, shift over towards our question and answer session and conclude this part of our webinar, I really want to re-emphasize everything that Nudal mentioned. It's important to find those opportunities for involvement, to be part of this conversation, and continue to be part of this process of engaging in the immediate changes that are coming. ADEP will continue to be doing more work in the coming weeks to discuss, how can we as a community be part of championing these issues. And I hope that you all can continue to stay tuned with us and, find ways through the opportunities that we present to continue to be involved in addressing this. We need to organize our community to be registered to vote. We need to be organized to make sure that we're all participating in the census. And we need to be organized to understand, how can we, have the basic tools to be able to, continue to empower one another to do this.
Right.
That's something that's going to happen in our leadership initiative. That's something that I hope that you all can continue to stay in touch with us about.
Yeah, and so to end, this stuff is not intimidating. The thing is, like, we've survived all this crap. We're just putting language to things that you have survived. And the fact that you're here, that you're watching, that your parents are here, you have survived harder things than some big words like critical race theory. Okay, like much worse things have been survived. We want to give language to empower you to really take it to the next level. And we have a lot of work to do in 2020. So this is the beginning of our Qatra Sessions to get us to the initiative and move us forward to really make an impact and be loud and be proud about who we are. So thanks so much for listening tonight.
Thanks, guys.
And we're back.
Hello, hello.
Hey. I'm a little more casual right now.
Yes.
The Q&A. Is Liz all joining us as well?
She is coming on
Yeah.
now.
I'm crashing this before I apologize.
Thank you. In case we fight, you can be the mediator.
Yes, and first of all, thank you to everyone who stuck with us through this entire time. Hopefully now this will all pay off with this question and answer session.
Yeah, so any questions that y'all have, reflections, we pre-recorded just for brevity's sake. But any thoughts, questions, reflections, and then we can scroll up. I know there's some comments while the video is going on.
I want to start briefly by making a connection back to our first Qatra session, led by Rizal. Rizal, as you were listening, I know yours was talking about the crisis of environmental racism. Could you just catch up some of our viewers briefly on what the connection is between these two discussions?
Yeah, of course. This is kind of off the cuff, so you'll have to actually watch the webinar to get the full effect. But essentially, in that session, we went into detail about the difference between environmentalism and environmental racism. One being the preservation of wilderness, of outdoors, which is environmentalism, and then environmental racism being people of color not having decision-making power in environmental issues that affect them. So whether that's water supply to land use to a whole range of things, race is a critical component of environmental racism. So actually, when you were going through your presentation and you talked about people living in segregated spaces and redlining and housing exclusion, and it seems like just a race issue, I think all of these are really, really tied into environmental racism, because where you live affects if you have good streetlights, or affects whether or not you have good water. And all of these are so tied together that I think this session was really good in building upon that. And I actually have a question. I have a quick. Yeah. I know I'm kind of cheating because we should be taking it from the audience, but y'all are quiet right now. So I kind of want to know, how do you think Afghans contribute to? We know Afghans are, you know, a marginalized group, but how do you think Afghans contribute to white supremacy? And is
Okay, I need to start with my eyes. How do we contribute to, I mean, so one, we are racialized, so we negotiate race. But another thing I would say, and Ridwan, feel free to chime in, is that there's a racial hierarchy, and if we're white passing, then sometimes we get off easier in terms of being able to sort of walk through life, distancing ourselves from being Afghan, from being considered as a person of color. And a lot of Afghans like the N-word, and we've discussed this in multiple forums. It's come up in different Afghan community spaces outside of ADEP, and there have been conversations about whether anti-Black racism does exist within Afghan communities. So I think that our contribution is that we could make the problem worse. We can be complicit if we allow people around us to be racist towards other communities. And it's not just towards Black folks. It can be towards Japanese, Koreans, like just any other group that also fit, like Mexican migrants. Like we are at risk of like making the same mistakes that we point others to. I heard someone wrote down, shout out to Zainab Mohseni, colorism is huge within our community. Zainab John, if you would like to type more, I'd love your thoughts on say more, because there are people within our community. So there you go. From the audience itself, thank you, Zainab John. I think it's huge. So colorism being that there is a preference for lighter skinned individuals than darker toned individuals. It affects our beauty standards, and sometimes women who are lighter skinned may say with their, you know, our offhand remarks that they are more beautiful than other women. Zainab wrote, we tend to favor people with lighter skin. And yes, so in terms of judgment making, that may also come up too. We have ethnic minorities in Afghanistan. So Hazara people are a community within Afghanistan that are subjugated for several reasons, right? They're also part of a religious minority. They're Shia predominantly. So this, like, the way we treat people who are Afghan themselves also contributes to it. I really want to uplift what Zainab John is saying and just read what she's saying for those who are sort of like catching up on the chat. Zainab John writes, I am Hazara, and the amount of times I get "you don't look Afghan" from other Afghans is insane. Microaggressions are real. The fact that someone says that, that's like delegitimizing your existence, right? Ridwan, what do y'all think when you hear that? Thank you so much for sharing. That means a lot to us.
Yes, and I just want to lift that up again, because I think we need that kind of vulnerability to keep this conversation going. But I think to answer the question that was all mentioned directly as well, and also to mention the question that was asked earlier about the definition of intersectionality, a lot of what you just mentioned, Nura, is intersectionality itself. And a lot of our conversation on our last Qatra session was about intersectionality. To briefly define it in the best way, intersectionality essentially is the different ways in which our social identities and social issues intersect with one another. You know, how does being Afghan intersect with being American? How does being Afghan intersect with being an immigrant? How does that intersect with social class and such? So when we talk about, how do Afghans contribute to white supremacy or to racism, I think it's also interesting to think about that a lot of Afghans come from, an immigrant perspective where they think that because, they grow up in, sometimes in working class environments, that they think that they connect to a lot of other people of color. And because of that, they feel empowered to use language like the N-word. And so I think it's really important to think about that context that our community comes from, and that to remember that even though, a lot of times some of our community members may come from that kind of, class experience, that doesn't necessarily mean that, they should still feel empowered to use such, dehumanizing language. And I think that's the way in which we kind of like fall into this trap, is because, a lot of our community members come from that perspective and don't necessarily, find the connection that exists between that.
And I want to also clarify that intersectionality is a term academically draws from Kim Crenshaw.
Yep.
And it is the way that race and gender function. So when Zainab brought up colorism, it's that women are seen as less beautiful. Women are valued by their physical appearance, and then how does race come into it? Darker toned women versus lighter toned women are valued differently. So suddenly race and gender are operating with each other in a way that kind of complicates issues. So really that's where the analysis emerges from. I wanted to turn to Sarah Nurzai's comment. She writes, I think as a diaspora, we've also been taught to be thankful towards Americans, aka white people, for giving us opportunities as migrants. With that said, we've been told to just blend in and not question or challenge things. Don't try attention to yourself. What do y'all think about that?
You want to go ahead with one?
Sure. I mean, I deal with this a lot. I come from an experience where, I've been in a lot of spaces, organizing with Asian American communities. And that's where I feel like I see this issue come up a lot as well. And that's where I feel like there's a parallel in the Afghan experience, in that, we similarly internalize our oppression. We have this, fixation upon, blending in and, not drawing attention to ourselves, and, finding ways to ensure that, we assimilate into a society. But oftentimes, the most simple issue that happens is that, you lose your identity, by that obsession with, whitewashing and, assimilating to standards. And in the process, losing some of your understanding of your, different cultural norms or language and such, that are, oftentimes when you enter older age are, fundamental to understanding, what distinguishes you from others in different settings.
And I think it's really interesting. I want to tie it back to something you had mentioned earlier in your presentation about how people's values connecting with what they bring and capitalism and what they contribute to society and how much money is made off their backs. I think oftentimes with the Afghans, we see this narrative that, we came here, we work really hard, for the boss, like we're really good people, we contribute to society. And that in itself is, in a way, this like the type of discourse that we see people used to place on the Chinese immigrants, on the Japanese immigrants, and how we now place even like in ways of justifying why like Latinx communities should be allowed here, because of because we see them as commodities. And in some ways, I feel like Afghans we see ourselves as commodities because we've gone through this like established way of coming here, working really hard, getting an education, contributing to society. So it's really weird, this intersectionality and of being playing all these different roles of both contributing to white supremacy, but also, being punished by it, and then seeing ourselves as commodities and seeing others as it's so bizarre. It's so bizarre.
And I think that one of the things I've come across recently is that we're not here by choice. Our country was disrupted by war. It's not like we just came for economic opportunity. Yes, like our great uncles, I remember they did study abroad in like the Europe and the US with the intention to go back home and never leave back home, right? Like, but something happened that brought us here, and that something was U.S. meddling, Western powers meddling, the Russian meddling. Like, we didn't just show up. So part of it's like, do we really have to be thankful because we're here because of the mess they caused in our homeland, right? And so I think about that a lot, and that applies to all. There's this really good book by Jamal Aiden about the idea of the Muslim world, and it talks about like how, I mean, there's hardly a space in the world that hasn't been touched by colonialism, right? So they played, you know, they're playing like bowling. They're bowling with us as like human things, and there are consequences. The consequences are that they're disrupting our lives, and so we try to reconfigure. So that's something that is lost on the immigrant narrative. Is yes, we're lucky to have survived, but who do we owe that luck to? We don't owe it to the government that also disrupted us, right? And I'm not saying like don't be disloyal. Yes, we should be blessed, but we should obviously be critical about that too. And I think that that's a really good conversation to have with our parents, because this emerges from some of the ways we were raised, and I think they did their best to raise us as well as they knew how. But now I think we're in a position to really have some like intense conversations about with them to sort of unpack some of this.
Yeah, no, and I really want to appreciate, I appreciate a lot of what you mentioned, because it hits at, the fundamental purpose of this webinar. A lot of that history that we have unpacked over the course of this webinar, and a lot of what you just mentioned, Noodle, about the history of colonialism and Afghanistan, a lot of that is the kind of education that we don't get conventionally in primary schools. The way that our institutions are currently structured to continue to empower that legacy of history to continue, so that the majority forgets about it, and then we're left with a minority who knows about it but doesn't necessarily have enough comrades in that kind of a space to be able to build the power to challenge that kind of a history. And so, the purpose of this webinar, and we hope that all of you that are tuning in continue to stay engaged with this, because we need more people that are understanding and engaging with this history and are catching up on this education. Because even I myself, a lot of what I discuss on this webinar are things that I've only learned in the last couple of years. And so I think that it's really important that we continue to kind of stay tuned with this.
Definitely. Zainab, John brought up, how do we talk about racial issues with our families? I think, so we put up a link to the lynchings thing, and so my mom is more into this stuff. My dad is from Herat, and he's like the quintessential Herati man that, it really it takes a lot to push him to like talk about things. So he likes visuals, so I put up a map, and then we started going through the map, and then that spurred a very random conversation. And the first time we did it, I think it was weird, but because I did it with Ridwan and another sibling of ours, it made it less weird because he was weirded out by it, but it's just sort of started a conversation. And I can't say that it wasn't awkward at times, because like it's kind of like bachim, like, why did you suddenly bring this up? We're drinking tea, and now suddenly I'm looking at a map on Google of lynchings. So that was my awkward way of just being like, let's just rip the Band-Aid off and do it, and then start having these conversations. So that was my creative way of doing it, is with visuals. Ghazal, Ridwan, others that are like tuning in, if you have suggestions for me, that's how I started talking about lynchings with my dad, because I noticed that men around him, grown men, also use derogatory language about Black folks. It's not just people our age, it's our elders too. And that's sort of why Ridwan and I and one of our sisters sort of were like, let's talk about this with our parents, because I think my dad can influence like the other men that are his age to sort of be more mindful.
Yeah, I think it's really a process, and the way I've engaged a lot of my younger cousins, a lot of my cousins grew up, in this new Twitter generation, in the way that, different things are being normalized. And I think that, it's a process. I think it takes a lot of patience to have that conversation. But the best way, like Noodle mentioned, is to really make it personal and uncomfortable. Sometimes you have to draw, parallels to, things that happen in, their individual lives, for them to understand that, this isn't just like some fiction that they see on TV or online on Twitter. This is a real reality that happens in their community, that happens to people that they know, in order for them to process that connection. Like, oh, this actually happens. And by my, playing into these kinds of stereotypes, and by perpetuating a lot of this oppression, I too am playing a role in, continuing this cycle. Rizal, have you had an experience with that?
I don't think I'm as advanced as the Siddiq siblings are, and talking about issues of race with my family. And honestly, that was because I didn't realize how much race contributed to what I was interested in initially, which my background's in architecture and city planning. It only took a while for me to realize how ingrained racism is in virtually every field of study. So once I've realized that, I've slowly started, again, I think somewhat Arash wrote, decolonizing takes time. I recommend starting slow and slowly building up the conversation. I think that's where I'm at right now. Now that my siblings are grown, being able to have, a joint sibling attack is always helpful and a good way to go.
Maki just wrote, or talking about just current events, gun violence, and how it ties into race. Yeah, it's made, the times are so stark now that I think that it's so evident to them in a way that may not have been before.
Definitely. And I wanna kind of shift this conversation just a little bit and talk about some of the things that we mentioned right at the end of the pre-recorded session, and also link back to, Rizal's session as well, to talk about, what are ways that we can challenge these institutions that perpetuate this kind of oppression. How do we continue to engage our community and build the kind of power that's necessary to ultimately disseminate this kind of information?
We should wrap up because it's almost 11 on the East Coast. Final thoughts. Thank you so much, viewers, for participating with us. We're going to put up more links. And really, again, this is leading up to, hopefully we'll have all of you joining us for the Winter Leadership Initiative, where we will really extend on some of these conversations. It'll be interactive, and we'll get ready for the crazy that is 2020.
Absolutely, yeah. Like Nura mentioned, there will be more info on our website and social media. And this webinar as well will be going on our website. So in case you missed a part of it and want to catch up or want to show it to your friends, please make sure to check it out online. We'll also be posting clips in the next couple of weeks. So, yeah.
Until next time.
Thanks, everyone.
Shab bakhair.